Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Amen. Please be seated. When you turn from the dark-skinned Jesus and prepare to leave St. Anne's, there is a large red sign with white cursive lettering over every door which reads, "You are now entering your mission field." St. Anne's is an Episcopal church located in the Tremé neighborhood of New Orleans. Tremé is just to the east of the historic French Quarter, the part of New Orleans we see in videos, hosting floats and large crowds, with beads being thrown and various articles of clothing being discarded. Tremé doesn't get that kind of attention. Instead, outside of St. Anne's, they have a memorial commemorating all the people who have died this year by gun violence. Instead of beads being thrown, St. Anne's collects Christmas presents from gay bars. Presents that Catholic Charities won't accept and Toys for Tots won't accept because of the sexual orientation of people making the donation. And they distribute these toys across the neighborhood. Instead of hosting throngs of people in their 20s or people wishing they were in their 20s, St. Anne's hosts kids after school, feeding them a snack, working on homework, working on art, feeding them dinner, and then bringing them home at the end of the day. None of these things take the form of a traditional Episcopal worship service, and each of these things is a way they will know that we are Christians. I was thinking about St. Anne's as I read in today's gospel. The Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs to every town and place where he himself intended to go. To be honest, when I have read that line in the past, I've always read it in the context of seeing the Gospels as something of a travelogue. Though Jesus was from Nazareth, which is part of Galilee, which is way up here, if you're thinking about the geography. He was born in Bethlehem, which is way down here, very close to Jerusalem. Going back and forth or up and down across what we now know as modern Israel, he had to pass through Samaria, which is where we get the Good Samaritan story. You see, there was a big split between the early Yahwists and where they understood God to be located. Samaritans believed God was located at Mount Gerizim. Judeans believed God was most fully present at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and thus began one of the earliest versions of the Hatfields and the McCoys. There's more to that story, but I'll save it for another day. So I tended to follow this part of the gospel like a travelogue. Where is Jesus going? Who will he meet next? How will the people closest to him misunderstand what he was trying to say? It's a story of intrigue and suspense. But as I read the gospel today, I began to think it was less about a town and more about the place. And I thought of St. Anne's. And I began to wonder if a travelogue is the most helpful way to understand what is meant in the text. Let's think back to the places St. Anne's is touching. Those who have been murdered by gun violence, which our civil society is currently incapable of abating. Those, even in this day and age, who are told they are something less than human because of their sexuality and the way they experience love. Those who, because of poverty and the vast and growing disparity of wealth we are experiencing in the United States, and are otherwise unable to participate in many of the things we took for granted when we were growing up, that our children and our grandchildren take for granted. Things like music lessons and homework help and a safe place to play, a place just to be kids. Don't you think these are the places where Jesus wants to be? I was in New Orleans for a conference, or maybe it was a retreat, I'm not sure. It was sponsored by Genesis 2. Genesis 2 is part of the National Episcopal Church's effort on revision and renewal. That the Episcopal Church of the United States is investing time and resources in revisioning and renewing should not be a surprise. According to Gallup, when I was born in 1969, roughly 71 to 73% of Americans would have said they were members of a church or a synagogue or a mosque. Even as recently as 2000, 70% of Americans would have said the same. As of March of 2021, the number dropped below 50% for the first time. It dropped to 47%. And if the recent past predicts the future, the trends do not appear to be turning anytime soon. The Episcopal Church is not immune, but it's rather representative of these national trends. According to the Episcopal News Service, the Episcopal Church has seen declining membership to varying degrees since the 1960s. In the 1960s, it counted 3.4 million members. As of 2019, it had about 1.8. Membership is down 17.4% over the last 10 years. Quote, "The overall picture is dire," says Reverend Dwight Scheil, an expert in denominational decline and renewal. "It is not one of decline as much as demise. Within the next generation," goes on to say, "unless trends change significantly." An Episcopal priest, Scheil is a vice president of innovation and associate professor of congregational mission and leadership at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. Quote, "At this rate, there will be no one in worship by around 2050 in the entire denomination." What can we do? Well, Genesis 2 has a couple of ideas. First, they want you to think about the life cycle of organizations. Let's take an organization you might have heard of, Apple Inc. It's a well-known company. You might have an Apple phone in your pocket. You might listen to music through their Apple streaming service. You might watch your favorite show developed by Apple Studios. You might pay for your Sunday lunch with Apple Pay. But Apple Inc. didn't exist in 1976. In 1976, Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne started the Apple Computer Company. Like most people with an idea, they tried to make it work. They struggled a bit. And when they finally got something and began to take off, I remember in high school, this was in like the mid-'80s, everyone was exceptionally excited when the computer lab finally got an Apple Macintosh. And for those of you around in the early 90s, the really trendy thing was to have an Apple computer with a fluorescent hard shell that glowed while you were working on it. It was a thing. But my point is not to follow the evolution of Apple computers, but rather to note that if what is now Apple Inc. had stayed Apple Computer Company, we would be speaking of them in the same terms we speak of Honeywell or Compaq or Digital Equipment Corp, where my dad worked. You see, most, if not all, organizations start with an idea. The idea becomes something. More people join, the experience grows, and then they experience growth, and at some point they reach a plateau. At this point, for most organizations, the game switches. It switches from innovative new ideas to how do we hang on to our success right here? How do we, as long as possible, how do we extend the tail? Kind of going way down like that. Sometimes the tail extends for a couple of years. Other times it's for a couple of decades. Sometimes, for lucky organizations, it's a couple of generations, kind of like way down like that. And I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, Michael, isn't the Christian church close to 2,000 years old? Which is true, but it has not always been in the same form. The church that Paul speaks to today in Galatians is very different from the church of the Council of Nicaea and what followed after Constantine. Likewise, the church is different from what the church looked like in the Middle Ages. And similarly, that church looks different from what transpired after the Reformation. Phyllis Tickle, a church historian, was famous for saying every 500 years the church is compelled to have a giant rummage sale in which it trots out things that have been accumulated, things like doctrines and traditions and practices, and sorts through them to see what should be kept and what should be discarded. The Spirit is always present. The Spirit is always moving. We must move with it, or we risk, as Pope Francis mentioned, being curators of a museum dedicated to how things used to be. The people associated with Genesis 2 suggest that rather than try to figure out how we can extend that tale as long as we can, we should instead be looking for the places Jesus would like to go. They suggest we begin that process by doing an assessment of ourselves and our communities. The tool we used in that retreat, the tool we used to assess ourselves, was something called a Strength Finder. Developed by Don Clifton, Strength Finder starts from a premise that we all have strengths, and that rather beginning with our deficits model, as in where am I screwing up, where can I improve, that we begin with our strengths. Where do I excel, and how can I contribute? This tool was paired with a model for looking at communities. Asset-based community development starts from the premise that all communities, even the most challenged communities, like the Treme neighborhood, have strengths. Certainly, the congregation of St. Anne's bore witness to these strengths. If we start from looking at our own strengths, perhaps becoming analytical, or having the strength of empathy, or perhaps the strength of communicating, or the strength of having a sense of responsibility. If we start from those strengths, or at least 30 others, and we pair our strengths with the strength of the community, where someone is a good cook, someone is a gifted teacher, where someone is an excellent musician, and then we ask, where does Jesus want to be? Where does Jesus want to go next? If we ask that question, the future of the church is bright. If you follow the travelogues of the gospel, you will see that Jesus moved from a largely Judean landscape to a geography that is inclusive of a vast array of peoples assembled around the Mediterranean Sea. Think back to the passage in Acts we read just a couple of weeks ago in Pentecost. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs, were all hearing things in their own language. Jesus was not thinking about how to draw the circle closer. Jesus was not wondering, how can I figure out how to reduce the number of people who love God? Jesus was instead looking for new destinations, new places, new journeys. Last week, we read of Paul's list of sinful things. Today, we read, my friends, if anyone is detected in transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such one in a spirit of gentleness. Our challenge today is not to remove every blot of human failing we see around us. Our challenge, our opportunity, our calling is to find the places where Jesus wants to go and to prepare the way. I'll conclude with a poem called Good Bones by Maggie Smith, and I'll confess that I've modified a word to make it more appropriate for our worship, but you can easily find the original text online. Life is short, though I keep this from my children. Life is short, and I've shortened mine in 1,000 delicious, ill-advised ways. 1,000 deliciously ill-advised ways that I'll keep from my children. The world is at least 50% terrible, and that's a conservative estimate, though I keep this from my children. For every bird, there is a stone thrown at a bird. For every loved child, there is a child broken, bagged, and sunk in a lake. Life is short, and the world is at least half terrible, and for every kind stranger, there is one who would break you, though I keep this from my children. I'm trying to sell them the world. Any decent realtor, walking you through a real cesspool, chirps on about good bones. This place could be beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. When you leave the church today, remember you are now entering your mission field, and let the church say, Amen.